Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. And welcome to the Carnegie Endowment. I'm Andrew Weiss. I'm Vice President for Studies, and I'm really delighted that so many folks have turned up today. This is, if I'm properly counting, the second event we've had during our week of events dedicated to the first anniversary of the Ukrainian Revolution. We will have more stuff. Yesterday we had a live debate here hosted by NPR on the question of arming Ukraine, and the next week we'll have two more or three more events, depending on how you count. But I hope folks will also turn up. We're showing a movie by a prominent Ukrainian director, Sergei Loznitz, a documentary about what happened on Maidan, which will be on Wednesday evening, followed by a discussion with two correspondents who've just returned from Donbass, Philip Shishkin of the Wall Street Journal and Max Seddon of BuzzFeed. So keep an eye out for announcements of those events next week. Before we get started, if I could just ask folks to please turn your cell phones on mute, because this is event is being live broadcast, and I'd hate to have your novelty ringtone interrupt that broadcast. It is a great pleasure to have these three colleagues here and close friends. Their book is very important. I hope folks will take the opportunity to buy copies of the book in the back. I would only point out the first chapter will pretty much, if all you read is the first chapter, I think you will do yourselves a huge service. It's probably the most detailed explanation I've seen of how this conflict did not come out of nowhere, that this conflict has deep roots in the region, and that the tensions over Donbass go far back, far more than I realized, in terms of the history of both Ukraine, but also the history of the relationship that emerged in the post-Soviet collapse, 1991-1992 period. There's not much to say about Eugene Rumor that hasn't been said. He's the director of our Russia-Eurasia program here in Washington, D.C., very prolific writer and thinker on these issues, former National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia. Raj Menon, professor at City College in New York. In addition to the many writings and books that he's published, I think this is the first time he's co-written a book with Eugene. But for me, Raj will always have a very special place in my heart, in that his wife was my freshman Russian teacher and basically changed my entire life by getting me interested in this field. So I owe. No, I was terrible. And David Hoffman, of course, the longtime Washington Post former foreign editor and author of The Oligarchs and the Dead Hand. So with that, gentlemen, please begin.
Great. Well, thanks to everybody for coming. We're sorry about the snowstorm. We didn't arrange it. We had wondered whether we could have gotten Yuri Mikhailovich Luzhkov to come and seed the clouds and change the weather, but we were unsuccessful at that. So thanks for coming again a few days later. This is a terrific book, and I'm really happy here to be talking with the authors, just so you can see the cover. It's very important. Please grab one if you haven't already. I was last invited to come talk about a book here 3.5 years ago. It was 2011, early September, and Dmitry Trenin of Carnegie had just published a book called Post-Imperium, and I led a discussion here with Dima about that book, and I was just the other day, pulled it off the shelf and looked again at some of the notes and some of our discussion, and it was a very optimistic time. Dmitry Medvedev was president and nearing the end of his term, and I noted in introducing the book that Trenin had concluded from his study that Russia had gone through a four-dimensional crisis since the 1980s and had let go of communism, had abandoned central planning, had walked away from the Cold War confrontation, and lastly, had given up the imperial state. And if you go back and look at that book, you'll see that Trenin makes the argument that among all the other things happening to Russia at the time, that it did not attempt to restore the empire. And he wrote, there are not many active military conflicts over the borders post-Soviet Russia. Most of the former republics, he said, are comfortable in their own skin. Well, it's 3.5 years later, and things have changed pretty radically. And I just wanted to mention this as a starting point for a discussion today that I hope will help cast some light on what has happened in those past few years to change things, and where are we going. And I think that this book is just chock-a-block full of important history about where we've come from. But we're not going to give you a history lesson today. I hope that we'll build on this and ask both of the authors to help us look forward. because there's a lot of uncertainty, I think, especially in the West, about how to respond to this crisis. So we're going to divide up our presentation of the book into 4 relatively quick parts and then take questions. The 4 parts will be first, Jean will address the question of how did we get here. Then Raj will take on the topic of Ukraine. What has happened? What lies ahead? Then we'll switch back to Jean again to ask the same questions about Russia. And lastly, Raj will take a look at the West and the United States. Where do we go from here? And after that, we'll open it up for questions and hopefully have a really terrific discussion, and we'll all leave certain about where we're going. So with that, let's open it up. Jean, how do we get here?
Well, David, first of all, thank you. Thank you to all of you for coming here today. Thank you to Raj for inviting me to participate in this project. It's been really a delightful joint venture, and I look forward to maybe another volume on post-Imperium or something along those lines. There is a short answer that probably will not be sufficient to the question of what happened. And Dmitry Trenin is a friend, a valued colleague here at Carnegie, and also a past co-author, because he and I once wrote a book together for which Raj wrote a foreword some years ago. It was about Central Asia. But what happened really is that later that month, in September of 2011, Mr. Putin decided to reclaim the presidency of Russia. And to anybody who says that personalities don't matter in politics, I will say think again. But there were also more long-term structural factors that I think we tend to overlook at times when it comes to thinking about trends that countries will follow and policies that their leaders will pursue. I still believe that a lot of what Dmitry has said about Russia being in its post-imperial phase still is true, that we're not looking at Russia rebuilding the old empire, but I believe that Russia is moving towards some new form of perhaps being a hegemonic state in the space that it defines to be vital for its own interests. Perhaps we analysts oftentimes don't appreciate the extent to which historical, structural, and geographic factors really matter in shaping policies and politics of countries that we're observing. Jumping to how did we end up here, I can say that not just in 2011, but I had a chance to visit Kiev in September of 2013, 2 months before the outbreak of the Maidan Revolution. And there was not a single person I talked to in Kiev, and I talked to a lot of people, as many as you could cram on 2 or 3 days in that city. Nobody predicted what would happen in November of 2013 when then President Yanukovych suddenly changed direction and decided not to sign the association agreement with the European Union. There was nothing on the political landscape, nothing on the economic landscape, nothing on the security landscape of Russia and Ukraine to suggest at the time to us that the two countries would go to war. And what I think we were insufficiently appreciative of is the extent to which Mr. Putin himself took seriously the idea of Eurasian integration as a new form of Russian dominance in the post-Soviet space. So the events that led up to the crisis that began in November of 2013 are really something that I would compare to 4 large ships moving on their courses, which are destined to collide, but the collision point is somewhere over the horizon, and they don't have the radar to see that collision point. So they're proceeding not blindly, but not necessarily well informed. And these 4 ships were Russia, the United States, Ukraine, and the European Union. For Russia, it was the pursuit of this Eurasian integration idea that Mr. Putin clearly took very seriously, even if we didn't. For Ukraine, it was the path of trying to sit on two chairs at once. One, the European chair, and pursuing a deal with the EU that would result in financial benefits and a hedge against Russian domination in the form of the association agreement and a free trade agreement with the European Union. For the EU, it was the course of pursuing essentially a new form of association with Ukraine that was intended to bind Ukraine more closely to the European Union and, in effect, install a barrier in relations between Ukraine and Russia, but without realizing the full consequences of what those negotiations would lead to. And I should say that much of what the EU was doing at the time, and I think really the European Union and its leaders were key players here, much of that was viewed as an expansion of EU norms and values into this in-between space between Europe and Russia. But it was pursued by two critical leaders in the European Union, most actively the Foreign Minister of Poland, Radek Sikorski, and Foreign Minister of Sweden, Carl Bildt, who also, I think, as we show in the book, had a clear geopolitical agenda. And that was not lost on Russia, and it was perceived in Russia not as an expansion of norms and values, but rather as a geopolitical pursuit. And last but not least, the United States. The United States was going along with that pursuit, but really not terribly engaged because, frankly, Ukraine was not high on the list of priorities because that list of priority was dominated by a succession of crises that we're all familiar with, to include still Afghanistan, to include Syria, to include the Arab Spring, and on and on and on. So Ukraine just didn't come up high on the radar screen. So as a result of these sort of four ships colliding, we see the explosion that nobody expected in November of 2013. And from that point on, I think my view, and Raj, I believe, agrees with me, I know he agrees with me because he signed on to the book, we see a series of improvisations by all parties, and basically drawing a series of red lines that lead us to eventually the conflict in Novorossiya in eastern Ukraine. So it really was kind of a procession of not very well-informed parties by everyone.
Well, that's a good way to start. Let's unpack these four ships in the night. Raj, why don't you help us understand ship Ukraine?
Thank you all very much for coming. It's a little colder in New York than it is here, but I still admire your fortitude. There have been multiple events about Ukraine, and either you can't get enough about Ukraine or you've been very kind to us and you've shown up today. Thank you, David, for taking time from your own book. Can you all hear me? I think I'm supposed to turn this contraption on. Is this better? Good. Thank you for taking time from writing your own book. Thanks to you, Andrew, I think I said. And Jean, when this book was first put to us, my instinct was to dismiss it out of hand as a lunatic idea. And I found there was another lunatic that I could actually persuade to write it with me, and it's been a pleasure to do that. Before I get to ship Ukraine, let me just say a few words about some of the things that Jean said. I do agree with him, and we see, I think, this part of the world through remarkably similar eyes. I have great regard for Dima Trenin. He's a very smart person. I have not called everything right in this part of the world. I've made my share of mistakes, but I never thought that Russia, at some point, would not do what great powers tend to do, which is to reestablish itself in its neighborhood. There is a trope now that this is all an artifact of Vladimir Putin. Nothing could be further from the truth. If you look at the foreign policy statements of Andrei Kozyrev, for example, the sense that Russia was a declining power, but that it had to establish itself in its own neighborhood, the sense that intrusions into the neighborhood were not welcome, the ambivalence about NATO expansion, all of this was there. So when Russia began to become stronger, No one could have predicted that all of this would have happened. I was in Ukraine shortly before this crisis arose, and I didn't see it, nor did the Ukrainians. But in broad historical perspective, what has happened does not surprise me. Ukraine is territorially about the size of France, in population about the size of Italy. It is not like Kazakhstan or even Belarus. I think for Russians it is very, very hard, not for all Russians, very, very hard to come to terms with the fact that this country has become independent and has decided on its own trajectory. And furthermore, whatever the intentions may be behind the deep and comprehensive free trade agreement and the association agreement, the Russians never have and never will see it as purely an economic transaction. Nor, I suspect, would we if this were happening in our neighborhood. Now to Ukraine. There are two problems. One is the immediate problem, how to stop the war, and the other is the question of whether the Ukrainian economy will collapse. There's been a great amount of coverage about the war. I will talk about that in a second, but let me say a word about the economy. This may be hyperbole, but the governor of the Ukrainian State Bank was quoted the other day as saying that this had been the worst year in Ukraine's history since 1945. Well, I can remember some years in the 1990s that were not very good. But I think she does sum up the situation rather well. The hryvnia has lost more than half its value against the dollar in the last 12 months. Ukraine's foreign exchange reserves are enough to cover about 1.5 months' worth of exports. This year alone to creditors, it owes about $7 million, which is more than it has in the piggy bank. The economy shrunk by about 8%, and there is severe trouble down the line because we say to the Ukrainians that if you reform your economy, all good things will happen. But economic reforms such as what the IMF want and what we want and what indeed the Ukrainians will have to do are very popular, very unpopular and very painful. They will hit very hard the most vulnerable sections of society. Take, for example, pension reform, which every Ukrainian government has tried to delay for exactly this reason, or removing subsidies on an array of goods, but especially home heating oil and electricity and so on. So it's a very, very tough road, and you can design the most intelligent set of reforms possible. But the question is it politically feasible to make them work? Can you have enough political purchase to make them work? It's going to be tough for another reason. People have pointed to the wonderful IQ and brain power and youth that is now in Poroshenko's cabinet, and indeed it's an impressive group. But there has been in Ukraine a system of political economy that took root. Now, the bête noire, as it were, is always Yanukovych, and God knows I hold no brief for Mr. Yanukovych. But this system entrenched itself at least as far back as the second term of Leonid Kuchma. A system of crony capitalism and corruption and oligarchical privilege, if you will, took root that is going to be very, very hard to undo because there's a lot at stake for people who are very good at this, and they're not going to surrender this very easily. So you can have a PhD from the University of Chicago or Harvard, but when it comes to taking on people who do bare-knuckle politics, it's not going to be very, very easy. So the first question is, can Ukraine get enough help from the outside, or are we rather better at talking about how much help we'll give rather than giving it? Second, under the best of circumstances, can they push through the reforms they need to push through? Now the war. The first thing, obviously, to do is to stop it. This ceasefire is already unraveled. It's not just the Debaltseve, but there is this impending push, possibly through Mariupol. There's a tendency in crises like this to think, and the reportage and analysis on Putin suggests this, that he's got a master plan and he's figured everything out. And we're kind of improvising and sort of like platypuses, sort of not sure where we're going. I don't think he's figured it out himself. There's also the question of how much control precisely he has over the Donbass separatists. I'm not arguing that without his support they wouldn't survive, but there may be a little bit of a tail wagging the dog phenomenon having built up a lot of political capital by doing this, how quickly can he de-escalate? So the first thing that has to be done is to stop the war. I believe, and I think Jean believes, that a negotiation between the Europeans and Russia and Ukraine will not do the job. At some point, the United States is going to have to come in and engage Russia. It's going to be hard to do because the degree of animus and venom now directed at Russia, and I'm not saying there's not reason for that, makes it, I think, very, very difficult for a political leader in this country to do that kind of engagement. But absent that, I do not expect this to end quickly. I don't expect it to end quickly under the best of circumstances.
Very much. Thank you. That's pessimistic, but we'll take it apart again later. First, I want to hear ship Russia. Gene.
Well, ship Russia, and to pick up on the point that Raj has made, and I think it's an extremely important point, that we believe there is no master plan. And I think there is a problem here that Mr. Putin will have to address somehow, because let's say he pushes to Mariupol, and let's say he can freeze the conflict, or let's say we succeed in persuading him to freeze the conflict. What is he left with? Donbass is not really that much of a prize to want to hold on to. Many Russian observers have called Crimea, a suitcase without a handle. I think Donbass, after a devastating conflict, without really the resources to rebuild its economy and provide the much, much needed assistance to the population, is not a very attractive prize. What Mr. Putin needs is Kiev. He needs Ukraine. He needs Ukraine in Russia's orbit. And the more he pushes into Ukraine, the less likely, the less achievable the goal of bringing Ukraine politically back into Russia's orbit becomes. So it's not at all clear to me that there is a master plan here, but I think we have to allow, even though logically we have argued against it amongst ourselves, we've said that a military occupation of Ukraine by the Russian military is not something the Russians really want. And of course, it's a huge, huge military task, and then of course, after you win the war, you have to win the peace, and it becomes even more of a problem, as we know from our own experience. So logically, it's not something that Mr. Putin probably wants, but we can't rule it out because this piecemeal pursuit and desire to keep Ukraine boiling, to keep Ukraine off sort of its level keel, that could take them deeper and deeper into the country, which could really be a major disaster for both Ukraine, of course, and for Russia too. Where does Russia go from here? Clearly, I would say it's not only a major crisis for Ukraine, but it's a major existential crisis for Russia. And I'm not talking about the economic figures that all of you know, and I'm not going to repeat them. It's not just the economy. It's also about the vision of Russia that is likely to be dominant in Russia for Mr. Putin's term runs to 2018, and then he's eligible to run again and can be in office until 2024 for a long time. And it's an ideology that is taking place that basically has positioned Russia in opposition to the West as a separate cultural, as a separate geopolitical entity. It's hard to imagine, but it appears that Russia is basically throwing out the legacy of the last 25 years and moving away from the period that we all came to know as the post-Cold War into something new. And that applies to Russian domestic politics. It applies to Russian foreign policy. And in foreign policy, aside from all the uncertainty that's associated with the prospect and we can talk about that later, of a new confrontation in Europe, other options facing Russia are not particularly attractive. Russia's pivot to Asia is a work in progress, but so far we have yet to see a major statement of Russian policy in Asia Pacific, where frankly Russia doesn't hold that many cards. And the best they can hope for is play second fiddle to China in that bilateral relationship. But beyond the bilateral relationship with China, everything else really is, in a sense, terra incognita, because I've yet to see Russia play a role in Southeast Asia. And if Russia intends to pursue a partnership with Japan, that too is fraught with the obvious complications. So geopolitically, it's a very complicated game. And the neighborhood is not getting any better. There are challenges to the south and east. So it requires, a very different mobilization of national resources than what we've seen in Russia so far.
Okay, well,
David, may I add just a quick word to this?
yeah.
It'll be very quick. Just a word on the military situation. You may recall that Mr. Putin, at some point not long ago, was quoted as saying something such as, "I could be in Kiev tomorrow." That was actually an incomplete quote, taken out of context. But he can't be in Kiev tomorrow. There are all kinds of irresponsible things that are being done in the heat of the debate in this country. One is to tally up the number of Russian divisions, tally up the number of Ukrainian divisions, and do a kind of balance of forces kind of calculation. A lot of Russian divisions are Category 3 divisions. They're nowhere near half strength. It would take extraordinary hard work to bring them up to snuff. Once you leave the current ceasefire line, dare I say, you very quickly move into Ukrainian majority areas. Your supply lines get extended. Recall that the Russian army, in fact, did not acquit itself all that well, even in the war against Georgia. So, but quite apart from that, is it possible that there will be a thrust from Novozovsk to Mariupol and then to Crimea? Possibly. But if Mr. Putin does that, it seems to me, the consequences. By the way, this war has not only been a disaster for Ukraine, it's been a disaster for Russia as well in many ways. Its economy is now facing crippling sanctions, the double whammy of declining oil prices. But strategically speaking, if Russia burns its bridges with the West, which it's pretty much done, by advancing further west and further south, and setting about to, as it were, gobble up more of Ukraine, the Russia's relationship with the West is essentially over, and it will become a kind of second fiddle or satrap of a junior caliber to the Chinese. It's very interesting that China has been very, very careful in terms of how much political capital they put behind Russia. Not very much. And you don't have to talk to Russian national security experts for very long to realize that the last thing they want is to be left friendless, facing only China. So it seems to me that Putin is not altogether unaware of these kinds of things.
Well, listening to the two of you, I don't think the ships are getting any closer and nobody's radar is turned on. You've described a very volatile situation, a weak Ukraine economically and also militarily, a Russia where President Putin seems to have very few options but to continue to accelerate and deepen the crisis. So with all of this volatility, Raj, could you then put yourself in the shoes of a Western and especially a United States policymaker? How do we respond to this?
You don't want me making policy for the United States, David. We care too much about this country for that. As I said, I think one of the things that the president has to overcome is the poisonous atmosphere that has been created through no fault of our own. The Russians have a great deal to answer for in this respect, which makes it very difficult for us to engage. One of the things that I would suggest that we do is to stop what I would say is megaphone diplomacy, this gratuitous sort of hyperventilating and catharsis that might make us feel good, but it does not create the atmosphere for constructive negotiations. You may recall that when Angela Merkel and François Hollande were trying to put together this deal, our politicians were not particularly effective. Senator McCain had the supremely bad taste of insulting the chancellor in her own country by saying that what she was doing was nonsensical. So I think that
Foolish, to be exact.
Foolish, even better. So if we are to engage with the Russians, we have to start now laying the kind of groundwork. Because in these kinds of crises, and we talk about this in the first chapter of the book, there is an enormous amount of research that shows what happens during crises is that people don't look for new sources of information and reassess the situation. They double down into entrenched perceptions. They assume that the other person has a master plan and they're fiddling around. They assume that the other person sees them as they see themselves. And there is an enormous amount of worst-case scenario thinking. So under the best of circumstances, it's going to be very difficult. But I see no way out of this until Washington gets into the game and doesn't just operate from the sidelines.
So, arms to Ukraine? I mean, you've given me a partial answer. Let's do it quietly. And do what? Talk to Russia quietly. What else?
Arms to Ukraine, well, I've written about this recently, and I'm categorically against it. I think it is a foolish and dangerous policy. Because the fact of the matter is, however much Ukraine may be the victim here, however much we may sympathize with the Ukrainians, arming the Ukrainians on what is the Russian doorstep in a part of the world and in a country where they have much more interests, national security interests, than we do, and therefore much more of a reason to escalate, and by virtue of distance and geography can do so much more easily, is, I think, a very, very reckless thing. If we sell arms to Ukraine, there is no doubt in my mind that it will put us in a position of asking ourselves what we will do, because that will not make enough difference to the Ukrainian army's success, because Mr. Putin will escalate. Do we then say, well, we tried our best and pull out? That is not what will happen. Given the history of this country, everyone will start talking about, especially in Washington, the old trope, credibility will be taken out. It doesn't even matter if we're banging our head against a wall, our head is hurting, we have to keep banging our head against the wall because somebody might think that if we stop, we're weak, right? So I see this as a very dangerous plan. There is no thought being given to what it fails. And what if it fails? And if you supply arms to the Ukrainians, that will destroy, I think, the possibility of any engagement with the Russians. So I think we have to engage them. We have to engage them privately. And I think we have to recognize that in one form or the other, there is going to be, whether we like it or not, and I would rather that it wasn't the case, a preponderance of Russian influence in eastern Ukraine. The question is, what is the modality of that influence? Is it a frozen conflict? Is it annexation? Is it a settlement where federalization and decentralization, right, is coupled with some end to the war? One can think of many possibilities. But I think the idea that we can go back to the status quo that existed before the war began, unfortunately, is not realistic.
Well, I want to get to questions, but I'd like to ask one of my own first, just to follow up from where you were. We're going to come up on a campaign to elect a new American president. I assume that this confrontation in Ukraine is going to be a campaign issue, and I think a lot of people are going to ask, did we do anything wrong? Did we make some misjudgments in the last 25 years, and especially in the last decade? And you addressed this a little bit in your book, especially in the introduction. You write, the larger lesson of the conflagration in Ukraine is that there is no longer a European security architecture that Russia and the West recognize and are prepared to consider as providing rules of the road, however rough and ready. So, Gene, I just wondered, could you address this question of, did we err by not bringing Russia more tightly into security structure after the end of the Cold War? Should we even ask ourselves whether we erred? Was this a crisis caused by President Putin? Did we do everything we could have?
Well, as you said when we had this conversation a couple of weeks ago, that this book is just the first draft. that there'll be a lot more written, and there's a lot more to be written and researched about the history of the immediate post-Cold War era. On balance, it's a difficult question to answer. On balance, I think, and this is not a self-congratulating statement on my part, because actually I was not a supporter of NATO enlargement at the time, but looking back, I think the vision of Europe whole, free, at peace with itself and its neighbors was the right one. And, you know, we hoped that Russia would embrace it. It wasn't always executed the way perhaps it should have been, but on balance, I think it was the right policy to pursue.
But without Russia, it wasn't whole, was it?
Well, but you have to remember what Russia was at the time. And it wasn't only about Russia, it was about the rest of Europe as well. So, in retrospect, could we have just told what we called then Eastern Europe, you have to wait at the door until Russia is ready? I don't think it was right. I don't think it would have been right. I don't think it would have been the solution. I think it would have created more problems than it solved. What I think we have to realize now, and this is a huge task, and I don't believe it's going to be solved during the campaign. If anything, I fear the campaign is going to make the environment in which this conversation will take place worse and not better. But perhaps the benefit will be that it will put squarely this issue on our agenda. We have to think about a new security arrangement for Europe.
That's a big, tall order.
It's a huge. Chances I will not be a new Cold War. Chances I will not be Europe whole and free. Chances are it's going to be some sort of a hybrid arrangement, realizing both our commitment to our values and the reality of Russia's geopolitical dominance of parts of Europe. And the fact that even though the relationship, Rajas, you said, will be destroyed, we'll still need Russia at the table to solve a number of problems that both the Europeans and we have and will need to address. So it's going to be very, very challenging conversation about what to do, about what not to do, because what we don't do will matter as much as what we'll do. Inaction will matter. And it's, you know, there's no other way other than to just sort of commit to that course without preconceived notions and be open-minded about it.
You're making me very uncomfortable. You've described this great volatility in the center of Europe, and the European security structures have broken down, and now we have to kind of come up with a new one. Inaction's not a possibility, but we don't really know where we're going.
That's right, and I think it's a very precarious situation that we're in, because when we compare it to the Cold War, especially by the end of the Cold War, we knew what the rules were. They were pretty well established. We don't have those anymore, and I think that's a point that we make at the end of the book, that what we do, we better do carefully, because it's fraught with unintended consequences that could be very dangerous.
Raja, want a quick word before we go to the question?
Yes. There has been a great deal of debate about whether NATO expansion created this crisis. I think that's an absurd question. This crisis was created by a great many complicated reasons. But I will say this, both in the case of NATO expansion and in the case of the EU's Eastern policy, of which the DCFTA, the association agreement, were part, I think there was not an understanding that at some point there would be a Russian reaction. And there was no plan to deal with that reaction, certainly not on the Soviets' part. I was at the time not in favor of NATO expansion. In our book, we asked the question, imagine that the Cold War had ended and the Soviet Union had, quote, won the Cold War. And the Warsaw Pact extended into our hemisphere and decided to take on Mexico and Guatemala and Honduras. And we were told, you don't have to worry about a thing. The Cold War is over. This alliance is now a new kind of alliance. These countries have asked to join it. this is all meant in the spirit of fraternal goodwill, we would not have stood for it for a minute. Why would we expect the Russians to do anything different? That is different from saying that this policy, this crisis has its own dynamics, it seems to me. I will say just one last thing. I think Jean's point about the onset of the campaign in this country, when we take leave of our senses for about a year and a half, is very, very pertinent, because I think soon there will be the debate about who lost Ukraine, notwithstanding the fact that it's not anyone's country that belongs to the Ukrainians. It will be even more difficult, it seems to me, to do what I'm suggesting we do, which is to try to engage somehow the Russians along with the Europeans.
Okay, you guys aren't making me very optimistic, but now I'm sure we'll have some good questions. I'll call on you. We have microphones to help amplify your questions. Please direct them at which of the authors you'd like to ask. Keep them succinct so we can get everybody in. And we'll get started right here with Wayne.
Thank you, Wayne Mary. I'd like to challenge Dr. Menon on his proposal that only an positive direction here. I'm frankly incredulous about that, if only seen it from Moscow's point of view. The malice that they direct toward us is at least as great as any malice that we direct toward them. They see us today, both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue, as entirely adversarial towards them. They don't see anything like the range of views about Russia, let alone about Ukraine, that exist in Europe. They see our sanctions policy as motivated, in their perception, by a policy of containment and regime change. It is quite clear that the major European governments would not favor the kind of thing you're proposing. They have obviously asked us to sit on our hands. And finally, just looking at the president's administration, if the president were to try to implement the kind of thing you have suggested, I think he would likely face significant senior-level resignations, which would debilitate his foreign policy team. I just don't see it. I mean, I would be interested in how you see that the Americans getting more engaged in this issue is going to make things better rather than worse.
So, Mr. Mary, let's start with where you and I agree, which is to say that there's been an enormous amount of rhetoric. Apologies, I'm kind of technologically challenged at the best of times. So let's start, Mr. Mary, with the place where you and I agree. There is no question that the vituperative rhetoric on their side, the truculence, the conspiracy theories, all of that is going on. I am not here to deny that. You've said that the Europeans have asked us to sit on our hands. Well, that hasn't gone very well, has it? It hasn't gone very well. So if the status quo continues and there is no action on our part, and whatever European diplomacy there is fails, then it seems to me the situation becomes much more dire. As for people resigning from Mr. Obama's administration, they may resign because time is nearing and they're looking for private sector jobs, but I can't imagine anyone resigning on principle because the president decides to engage Ukraine. I frankly don't see it. I think the much bigger problem is, given, as you correctly put it, the atmosphere that the Russians have created by the war and by their rhetoric and sloganeering, and given that we've now begun to respond in the same coin, right? The atmosphere for us to do anything is extremely difficult. So my concern would not be that people will resign. My concern is not even that the Russians are engaged in sloganeering and bad behavior. Look, when in a crisis, one talks to one's adversaries, not with one's friends. One has no difficulty with one's friends. So I would say to you that I don't see where your end game goes. I mean, sitting on our hands and just watching this, it seems to me, would be highly irresponsible. There are certain things that the Europeans will not do without American cover. And the Russians are, shall I say, status conscious to this extent. I don't think they will take very seriously any process that doesn't involve us. That does not mean, I want to be very clear about this, that we negotiate over the heads of the Ukrainians and try to tell them what to do. It is their country. They should be at the table negotiating. But I would say, without having a clear sense of exactly what we should do, that we ought to get involved. I see no downside from it. I don't think it's going to be a catastrophe for the president if he summons the courage and does this. There will be a huge amount of backlash from the opposing party. Resignations from the government, I don't think so. And if people don't agree with the president's policies, the honorable thing to do is to resign. And the president can find other people who agree with his policy.
Gene?
Just a quick comment, Wayne. I think we argue fairly persuasively in the book that one of the reasons, only one of the reasons, not the reason, but one of the many reasons, factors leading up to this crisis was the fact that the United States was not involved in shaping policy was not involved in the conversation between Ukraine and the European Union. That's in part how we got here.
Vacuums everywhere, okay. We'll keep coming to this right here in the front. You've had your hand up since the beginning.
Over here.
I'm Dr. Donner with the Franciscan Peace Center, and I would like you to comment on the role of the oligarchs in both Ukraine and Russia in this whole mess.
Well, I'll start. Clearly, they're actually very different roles that they play, as far as we can tell, because basically in Ukraine, you've had a revolving door between government and private business, which in itself is not bad, of course. But given the circumstances in Ukraine, when you have even the current president, Poroshenko, who is not the wealthiest oligarch but still qualifies, who has been through several governments and in the process of going through this revolving door accumulated substantial fortune and business interests both in Ukraine and reportedly in Russia, that sort of tells you something. And I think the oligarchs, based on reports that you see in open source, continue to play an important role in shaping Ukrainian politics. You hear reports, you read reports occasionally about, say, this well-known Ukrainian oligarch Mitra Firtash, who is currently under house arrest in Vienna, convening meetings with fellow oligarchs, making decisions apparently about the course of Ukrainian politics, shaping elections, and so on. In Russia, there has been this sort of line of thinking that because of sanctions and because of other economic pressures on Russia, the oligarchs will somehow rebel against Mr. Putin. And my reading of the tea leaves, and I think it's not just my reading of the tea leaves, is that the oligarchs in Russia play a very different role and that they are subservient to the Kremlin and basically depend on Mr. Putin for their continued success in business. So the Russian elite so far appears to be a lot more consolidated and behind the president in pursuing this line. At least we don't hear major defections. They're not quite the kingmakers that they appear to be in Ukrainian politics. Raj?
Pardon me. I would agree with that. The effect that the oligarchs have had on the direction of the Russian economy and on the scale of corruption in particular is told in a book that some of you or many of you may know by Karen Duisha. She's not the only one to lay this out. Nothing more needs to be said about that. They have, in some sense, hijacked the economy while being politically very quiescent. There are analogs that exist in Ukraine. Mr. Poroshenko himself was a former oligarch. The oligarchs are playing a role in Ukraine, though, that they are not playing in Russia, which is that because of the inadequacy, shall we say, of the Ukrainian army, a considerable part of the fighting in the East is being done by private militias, private armies that are funded by oligarchs. And so one question for the future also is, because I'm looking down the line, let's assume this all ends in a way that we can say it was a fair settlement. Will these militia be integrated back into the Ukrainian body politic, or will the oligarchs who run them try to use them as private armies to carve out their own place under the sun in the political economy of Ukraine? I'm not saying that will happen. I don't know, but it's certainly something that bears watching. So there's a military role that the oligarchs are playing in Ukraine that is not present in Russia.
I would like to add that David Hoffman has written quite a bit about the oligarchs in Russia as well.
In my time,
some defining work.
They didn't have armies to fight wars. They had armies to defend themselves on the street, but things have changed. All right, more questions. We have a lot of people interested. I'm moving from front to back a little bit. I'll get to everybody. Let's, Marvin.
Marvin Cobb with the Pulitzer Center. The question I have, and I hope you can help us understand a little bit more about this. What is going on in the Donbass now? And at the very beginning, when the little green men first showed up, were they there first, or was there a local kind of insurrection that they were supporting? Did Putin have at that time a plan in his mind? Was he surprised in any way by what has developed there? Can he call this off tomorrow morning if he wished? If you could help us through that.
In the case of, you've asked a very good question. In the case of Crimea, it's complicated. The Russian role was direct and clear. There is no question that what happened in Crimea would not have happened without a substantial role. I want to make that clear. On the other hand, and we talk about this in the historical chapter of the book, because Ukraine as a country now was in its long history ruled by so many different states and empires, it is a country in which social and cultural tensions are refracted into politics. So to be a little bit simplistic about it, the tensions between, shall we say, the center and west of the country and the south and the east have manifested themselves at least since 1992. In 1992, the Ukrainian parliament passed a bill on independence. It did so 2 years later. In 94...
The Crimean Parliament.
I'm sorry, the Crimean, what did I say? Ukrainian
Crimean,
Parliament?
yeah.
Excuse me, the Crimean Parliament. In 1994, in the Donbass, in 1993, there was a minor strike. It began over economic matters, but very quickly got into the business of language politics and federalization, and there was a whole lot of hue and cry about autonomy and so on and so forth there. The fact of the matter is that while the ethnic Russian population, or Ukrainians who identify as Russians, are only 20% or so of Ukraine's population, 80% of them are either in the Crimea or in the Donbass. Now, what is happening in the Donbass? It is a murky, murky battlefield. There are, without question, regular Russian troops there. I think one of the things that has discredited Russia, and this goes to Mr. Mary's point, is this constant denial that they're not there. Of course they're there. We have photographs showing that they're there. And these guys who are fighting as volunteers could not be operating sophisticated weaponry like counter-battery weapons and anti-tank missiles, and not to mention surface-to-air missiles that go awry, without substantial help from the Russian army. There are irregulars there. There are fighters from the North Caucasus. There are criminal gangs. One of the difficulties in understanding how the settlement comes about, and I don't know the answer to this, is it, because you've asked precisely the correct question, is this a tap that Mr. Putin can just turn off when he realizes that the price is right, whatever that price is? Or is he so much implicated in this politically now that it becomes difficult for him to do so? I wish I had an answer for you. I simply do not know.
All right, let's keep moving on. I've got a question back over here.
Hello, gentlemen. Thanks for your book. And my name is Nikolai Vorobyov. I'm Ukrainian political and military journalist here. I represent a Center for Eastern European Perspectives. So I spent around 2 months on the ground, and I'm really familiar with the situation, what's going on in battle zone. So like two remarks and then the question. So the first is, I think that, and Jim, you was absolutely right, because like people here, and including experts, they misunderstand the real like Putin's goal. So it's not Donbass. It's not only in Kyiv, but it's probably like whole Europe. That's why. So he is addicted by this idea. For him, Kyiv is a holy land, and he wants to take everything. It's not about Donbass. It's like you said, it's only a reason to diminish the power in Kyiv, and then just even to move further about his tanks in Poland and in Germany. We've heard about this a lot. And on the other hand, I think that we are here. We overestimated the capacity of their military troops on the ground. So you work on this book. Maybe you can answer to the question. Tell me about at least one successful Russian operation in Donbass for the last 6 months or something. Like taking Debaltseve, they just like desperately tried to take airport for 250 days. I mean, and people, you know who people were in this Donetsk airport, on Ukrainians? Like 30% of them, there were even like students or like some professionals who didn't keep a weapon before. They were not professional soldiers. So I think that their like military and their troops and their actual invasion is really miserable, and we really overestimate their like capacity in eastern Ukraine. And the question is about that we have this the main issue right now on the table about possible providing lethal assistance. And can you please answer the two like small questions? The first is, what will be the positive and the negative scenario of this? I mean, if it will be escalation, in what way? If it will be like peace, so maybe you can comment on this. Thank you very much.
Raj, I think you've addressed this once already, but give us a recap on lethal weapons to Ukraine, up and down.
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. Before that, David, if I may just ask the question that I believe he asked. I think I understood you correctly that, in your view, the capacity of the Russian military in that region has been exaggerated. Is that correct? Yeah. Well, yes and no. I would just ask you to think about two things. The turning point in the reversal of Ukraine's early military fortunes came when the Russians took a direct hand, in my view, in opening up a front in Novazovsk sometime last fall. And then we have a significant level of escalation that has enabled the rebels to gain about, 400 square kilometers recently. Is the Russian army capable of advancing and incorporating large parts of Ukraine? No, but I don't think that's their goal. They've been extraordinarily successful at two things: keeping the pot boiling and making this war extraordinarily costly for Europe, and putting a great deal of pressure on states that are nearby. So it all depends on how you define success. If it's in terms of strict military, professional, operational capability, I would agree with you, but I think that the game that they're playing is rather different. It's to make as much of a mess and as much trouble as possible in the East and try to extract the best price they can. I don't know what price that is. On arms to Ukraine...
Before you go to arms, could I ask you, there's a lot of bandied about this term that Russia's actually waging a hybrid war, that it's not a linear military force that's at issue here, that they're using asymmetry and hybrid methods. Do you agree with that? Is that terminology fair? And is that the mess you're talking about that's confounding Europe and the United States?
I mean, hybrid, David, to this extent, they're involved in a variety of ways. There is no, as I said, there's no question they're involved directly, but they're involved indirectly. The level of weaponry that's possessed by the separatists in the Donbass and the kind of operations that they have undertaken, however limited they may be, as Mr. Vorobyov said, could not... The idea that a bunch of people who were really angry and truck drivers and whatnot came across the border and this military conflagration began beggars belief. I just think it should not even be dignified with a response. So there's clearly a Russian role, but it's been a very, very careful role in the sense that they have escalated when necessary, pulled back when necessary, and I think the goal really is, in part, to bleed Ukraine economically to death. And in that respect, I would say that the war has been extraordinarily costly for Ukraine. And the Russian, Putin is cynical enough to say, oh, you believe in Ukraine united with Europe and possibly one day NATO and a democracy, well, good luck to you. Here's the check. I want you to pick it up, because by the time he's done with this, the Ukrainian economy will suffer greatly. So there is a connection then between what is going on the military front and what is going on the economic front, certainly for Ukraine.
Do you have anything you want to add to this?
Well, I fear that if I use the term hybrid warfare, military purists will criticize me, so I won't use it. But I agree with Raj. I think that the one thing that Mr. Putin has made clear is that he is not prepared to see the separatists lose in this conflict. So how good the Russian army is, I think it's almost irrelevant under the circumstances, because clearly it has the resources, it has the manpower, and even more importantly, the Russian leadership has the will to step in and provide the necessary amount of force to make sure that its objectives are accomplished on the battlefield.
Okay, Ambassador Collins.
Jim Collins from Carnegie. A pretty good friend of ours, a number of us, the other day observed that out of 64 conflicts in the recent era, only one has been settled by military means, but everything else has been negotiated. Now, I think this is perhaps instructive. And my question to both of you is, what's the negotiation going to be about? And who's going to be the key player or players in figuring out when you've come to terms? Because right now, it strikes me, we aren't even talking on the same page if you go to Kiev, if you go to Washington, if you go to Moscow, and probably if you go to Donbass.
Well, Jim, I mean, I would welcome your input in this conversation. I think you've had more experience with negotiations than quite a few of us, and possibly quite a few of us combined. But I would say you have to start with a negotiation, assuming that there are two sides here. Basically, there's Russia and the separatists on the one hand, and then Kiev, collectively Brussels, and the United States on the other. So you need to have pre-negotiation and agree what it is that is desirable and feasible that the West collectively can put on the table. Assuming that Moscow and Donetsk and Lugansk, or wherever the center of gravity is there, can come up with its own solution. And I am not suggesting that Lugansk and Donetsk here are entirely independent players, but they will have some sort of an input in it too, I imagine. So there needs to be that conversation. And I think it's going to be a very difficult conversation for the West collectively, because we'll have to make some compromises, which politically will be difficult for the leadership in Kiev to accept, for us to accept. But if we are to reach that desired end state that you're talking about, we'll have to make the compromise. And I think at this point, looking at the results of Minsk II, I think that even the goal of Ukraine reasserting its control over the border with Russia is unrealizable. And there's going to be some de facto nominal control of the border, but the real border will be between the separatist territories and the rest of Ukraine, wherever that front line is going to be. We may not see the actual front line at the present time. So I fear that acknowledging a measure of defeat under the circumstances is unavoidable. At least that's how it's going to be perceived. And then you engage Russia about what it is they want. But I think we're looking at Ukraine as sovereign within the boundaries controlled by the government in Kiev, I fear it's going to be a country with, not entirely free to pursue its chosen course in foreign policy because of the threat that Russia will continue to pose to it. So, others, and it's a very politically fraught term to use, but others, like, I'll invoke Zbigniew Brzezinski, have talked about a form of neutrality or non-alignment for Ukraine. I think some countries have used that model in the past with a great deal of success eventually. But as long as we can achieve a state in which Ukraine can concentrate on rebuilding itself domestically, I think it's a victory for us.
David, may I have just a quick word? First, Jim, giving you the benefit of my advice is rather like my teaching Magic Johnson how to do a jump shot. So in that spirit of humility, I will say, at one level, the mechanics of how to end this are simple, right? There has to be a ceasefire. There has to be a weapons-free zone and a troop pullback on either side of the border. This has to be policed by a third-party contingent. There has to be control of the Russian-Ukrainian border, never on the Russian side by third-party observers, but definitely on the Ukrainian side. So the mechanics of how to do this, I think you'll agree, we know how to do because we've done these things before. The question is, what will it take? So here it seems to me it's important to look not at Mr. Putin, who is someone in the driver's seat, but Mr. Putin, who's also seeing the plummeting in what is a hydrocarbon economy of oil prices with no prospect that they will recover. Mr. Putin, on the one hand, who says we won't buckle to sanctions, but on the other hand, clearly implies that sanctions are creating difficulty for the Russian economy. Would sanctions be put on the table, not front-loaded, put on the table in exchange for clear cooperation from the Russian side to make this happen? Neutrality for Ukraine is a very difficult thing because, we ought not to decide their foreign policy for them. But if they could be persuaded to agree not to neutrality on an open-ended basis, but neutrality for a 5-year period with the proviso that they can buy arms from whoever they want and get military training from whoever they want, would that be a possibility? Now, I'm thinking out loud here, but it seems to me punishment alone, which is what we've done, right, and I understand why we've done it, has not worked because the tighter the screws have been turned, the more Mr. Putin has escalated. I mean, Americans in particular, I think, are economistic in their thinking, right? But Mr. Putin is not an accountant. I mean, he's thinking in terms of passion and one-upsmanship and historical losses and all of this. And so the question is, what would be the price that we would be willing to pay, and when would we sequence it so that when we provide something by way of good faith, it is in exchange for something definite on the ground that lasts for some length of time? Because in the end, I think you said this correctly, this cannot be settled militarily. We cannot overcome the Russians by equipping the Ukrainians. The Russians, as Mr. Vorobyov said, I think are in no position to drive further west. Whenever this is settled, it'll be a political solution. It's going to be very, very difficult for the reasons that Jean has said and you well understand.
Okay, we have a lot more questions. Let's try and move briskly through.
Thank you, Mr. Hoffman. My name is Maria Usachova. I'm a Russian reporter and blogger based in Germany. So let's take the worst scenario for the Russian authorities, and the weapons will be delivered from the US to Ukraine. So do the same US authorities and think tankers have already a plan for Europe, what to do, how to proceed with thousands of Ukrainian refugees? So I know that you both experts don't support the idea of delivering weapons, but you are in touch with experts and authorities who are. So thank you very much.
Could you repeat the question?
I think the microphone is
We're not
turned
having
off.
trouble here.
Maria Osachova, Russian reporter in Germany. My question is, let's take the worst scenario and the weapon for the Russian authorities. And the weapons will be delivered from Ukraine, from US to Ukraine. So do the same US authorities and think tankers have already a plan for Europe, how to proceed with thousands of Ukrainian refugees? Because the situation would escalate for sure. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm neither a think tanker nor am I in touch with any authorities, I can assure you. Look, the refugee problem will undoubtedly get worse, but you say, well, do we, the United States, have a plan on how to deal with it? It seems to me that the problem is going to be Russia, because most of the refugees are going to cross the border into Russia, because these are Russian-speaking areas, so they're not going to come here. It will be, in a sense, a Russian problem. I don't know how to answer your question except to say for that and other reasons, I don't support the arming of Ukraine. My concern is, as much as I would be concerned about refugees, that if you're looking for the kind of political settlement, or political solution that Ambassador Collins referred to, I think this will delay and perhaps make impossible a political solution.
All right, let's get some more questions in. We got one right up here in front. Go ahead. I'll try and catch everybody here if we can.
Thanks. Hi, Arwan Nagadek from George Washington University. Can I take it back to the, as I understand it, your chapter 1 about how we got here, and especially this kind of Mearsheimer narrative of we are to blame, say, because of NATO expansion. But you mentioned early on, Eugene, the Eastern Partnership and the objectives of Carl Bildt and Radek Sikorski. A couple of questions there. Is it your sense that, yes, a case can be made, we are to blame because Carl Bildt and Sikorski created the Eastern Partnership specifically in a way that was designed to be exclusive of Russian interests, or were they naive about how this was going to be perceived in Russia? And I should say, if they were naive about how this was perceived in Russia, you also talked about improvisation. What strikes me is that Russia took its sweet while to realize it's seemingly that there was a serious problem with the Eastern Partnership. I mean, 2009, you find Lavrov saying that he might as well, that they might actually join the thing. And there's this sense of, a phone call from Putin to Yanukovych a week before Vilnius, like if they, in a panic, are realizing the full implications of Eastern Partnership. So it's a two-parters. I mean, how do you interpret the rationales of Bildt and Sikorski in Eastern Partnership? And second, would you say that Russia itself kind of improvised its reaction to the EU's policy? Thanks.
Well, I think that informally, both Carl Bildt and Radek Sikorski, they have oversized reputations on the European scene, and clearly they're very capable leaders. They're also very well known in Russia for their views and for their political skills. So I think, the idea of sort of a joint Polish-Swedish-inspired Eastern Partnership was something that was not lost on the Russians as not just an expansion of Western values, but also, Russians do think geopolitically. It's one thing that they sort of embraced with vigor in the 1990s and haven't given up since. So I think those personalities and statements that they made over time were, played a role. I don't want to say that they were the decisive, but clearly I played a role, and I think they played a bigger role than many other European leaders because, frankly, other European leaders were not paying as much attention, understandably too, because something I didn't mention in the beginning, but, Europe had more than its fair share of crises in that time too. Right. So that said, the Russian government, as we know, is not the best organized and well-oiled machine. And I think you are right in that they didn't quite catch on to the meaning of the Eastern Partnership. But as the date approached, and as the stance taken by the negotiators for Europe was that's either or, and there's not a lot of room for compromise, in fact, no room for compromise, I think that created a dynamic then that led eventually to the crisis. As to the question of whether they were improvising, the Russians, that is, I think they were. I think there is ample evidence to suggest that the series of moves that the Russians made throughout this crisis were not part of a long-term strategy. I mean, they're clearly long-term preferences, but as a matter of strategy, I don't believe that they had one. I think if you look at sort of the series of events, well, we don't know what transpired between Putin and Yanukovych in November, but when somehow Putin, in that secret meeting they had, I forget the exact date of it, but when Yanukovych pulled the plug on signing at Vilnius, I think Putin probably thought, hey, I got it, it's done. And then you have protests, which were completely unexpected, I believe, for all, including for Washington. And then there is a $22 billion package of assistance from Russia to Ukraine. $15 billion in aid, in loans, and $7 billion in gas discounts. And probably at that point, Putin thinks, I think I bought myself Ukraine. At least Yanukovych, and probably enough to get Yanukovych through the 2015 election. And when that doesn't work, sort of you have this progression. And then the February 21, 22 dramatic events when basically Yanukovych collapses. And that was unexpected. And I think that leads to the move in Crimea, which I take to be a panicky move. And when that doesn't work, it takes you to the Novorossiya and so on. So I agree with you in your assessment.
Okay, just behind you, the fellow with his hand.
Thank you. Paul Joyle, NSI. You've mentioned the possibility of what the West could offer Mr. Putin in order to bring this negotiation forward. I would like to ask the question, what are the constraints on Mr. Putin from moving in that direction? Namely, what today is the Russian national idea? Secondly, what effect internal to Russia has the new emergence of people who were in the background before into some type of prominence concerning the area of ideas? Men like Dugin, neo-fascism, the type of extreme nationalism that has emerged, and the very, very strident anti-American propaganda that's in the country. How does this constrain him? And if he does move for accommodation, does he risk his own political standing for those who support the compatriots abroad strategy, the Novorossiya, and all these ideas of recreating something larger than Russia is today?
So there is a little bit of a sorcerer's apprentice problem here, in the sense that having whipped up this, shall I say, almost jingoistic rhetoric, and having created in the Russian people's minds that they are surrounded by hostile enemies and so on, and having brought up the age-old question that goes back centuries in Russian history of who are we? Are we West? Are we East? Are we hybrid? You know, the Russians have been debating this for years. The question is Mr. Putin a victim of his own rhetoric? It certainly makes it more easy for him to extricate himself from this than we would think, because I think the general sense I get from reading analyses here is that he could end it like that if he wanted to. So I think if you're suggesting it could be more complicated, I think I agree. But he's a man having built so much on being a strong leader and a nationalist who will be obliged to take something home. That is to say, if he's going to make something that he would regard as a concession, he will have to show that something has been gotten in return. And I would say that's something that he's most interested in would be economic relief. We, for our part, have to be very careful in how we sequence it and what is offered at what time. But it seems to me that I don't think people like Alexander Dugin are going to prevent Mr. Putin from cutting a deal if he wants to. I mean, Dugin makes a lot of noise and says he's got connections in the Kremlin and so on, but he's not going to be the one deciding this. And I think in the end, if Putin makes the move and shows, because he commands the airwaves, that this is an honorable deal for Russia, he can do it. There is certainly no question that the climate that's been created in Russia as a result of this war, and mind you, this war is going to have effects not only on the Russian economy, but I think in the structure of the Russian polity, and I actually am quite concerned about the direction in which Russia is going even before this war. But I think it's doable for him, providing that there's something that he can show that has been given to him and that he can show was an honorable peace.
I have to say, listening to all of you, the cards that Mr. Putin has seem to be the firmest thing we can identify here today. Everybody else seems to be playing very weak hands. Some more questions. Over here on this side, I'm going to try and go back and forth.
Thank you. Judith Mandel, former State Department. I'd like to turn to the economic aspects of the situation in Ukraine. And given the weakness of the Ukrainian economy, its desperate need for some sort of external financing package, which is being held up because of a variety of internal factors, including the fact that reforms are going to be difficult to implement. What can be done to help the Ukrainians stay afloat and perhaps even improve their economic situation, even as the fighting either continues or settles down, when we understand that the stability in the East will be a long time in coming?
Raj, you want to tackle that?
In my mind, it's impossible, pardon me, to de-link the political economy of the war from the political economy of the Ukrainian economy. Because the longer the war goes on, the more it will cost Ukraine. And so giving Ukraine money that then it is obliged to spend some part of by defraying the cost of the war strikes me as not a very, very good proposition. There's another problem, it's kind of the moral hazard problem. I think that, as I understand the Ukrainian position, they've asked for substantial amounts of economic relief, but some breathing room in which to introduce the reforms. And I completely understand why they've done it, because these reforms are very, very difficult reforms. There will be short-term pain. You can tell Ukrainians 10 years from now you'll be like Sweden, but they want to know what they'll be like 5 months from now. And so the question is, do you give them the assistance with minimal preconditions and create a moral hazard problem? That is to say that they have no incentive then to do what they need to do. Or do you do this and give them some breathing space while the war is going on, knowing that that's kind of a mug's game, because the longer the war continues, the deeper the economic pressure on Ukraine, which is, I think, essentially part of what Mr. Putin is trying to do. But it seems to me that the problem that we can probably deal with more effectively than the military problem, which is not to say we shouldn't deal with it, is the economic problem. It is within our capacity, and certainly in the capacity of the Europeans and others who have money to whom we give protection, right, to say, if Ukraine is such a high priority, to give it as much money as we can in exchange for proper policies. There I have the utmost sympathy with the Ukrainians, and I would do as much as possible. The question is, will there be the kind of reforms that are followed through? The history of Ukraine so far suggests that we have to be very careful about that. The last great hope was during the Orange Revolution, and you know what happened to the reform program in that period.
Okay, over here on the side.
Mr. Menon, you
Could you identify yourself?
Oh, I'm sorry. Eleanor Bachrach. I worked in Ukraine for USAID for 5 years at a more hopeful time. You seem to be saying that the rising of a Putin was inevitable and that he will stay in power despite the Russian economy is not in great shape and is likely to get worse. There is the issue of negotiations, which seems to be kind of like Charlie Brown. He doesn't seem to be at all serious. Ceasefire is an opportunity to take more territory. Can he really, is there never going to be a reaction amongst the Russian people as their own circumstances get worse? Is this new Stalinism and terror, or has there been some possible change?
So if you understood me as saying that the rise of Putin was inevitable, I apologize, I misspoke. I didn't mean to suggest anything of the sort. I don't believe in historical inevitability, nor do I believe that NATO expansion caused it or the Eastern Partnership caused it. I think one thing you'll see if you read the book is that there are a complex array of problems going on. Your question essentially is, how vulnerable is Mr. Putin? So far, from what we know, unless someone can show otherwise, I don't believe that economic pressure has led him to rethink his current policy in vis-a-vis the war, nor has it so far, early days yet, led to some collapse of his political standing. But let's assume that the pressure could be put on to the point where there would be a systemic crisis in Russia. Do we want such a systemic crisis in a country with, what is it now? They cut back one time zone. Is it 11 time zones now?
So nine.
Nine time zones? Okay, whatever it is, right? Do we want, and this is not a plea for protecting Mr. Putin or backing Mr. Putin, but we think, well, this pressure will lead to a better outcome in Russia. Well, that's possible. But what's also possible is that it could lead to a worse outcome. For the moment, anyway, that's neither here nor there, because what we have to deal with, whether he was inevitable or not, is the fact of Vladimir Putin. And if, in fact, we're talking about a political settlement, the modality is, however much one may not like him, and I take Mr. Mary's point about all the terrible things he's done on the verbal front and on the ground, but he's the man who's there that one has to deal with. And the question is, what is a deal that will give him enough to change course, but that an American leader can sell here as something other than total appeasement? As the calendar moves on and we get toward the election, that is going to be much, much harder. I will say something to you which I hope is not true, which is that when we meet, if we were to meet here next year, I think this crisis in some manifestation could well be with us. I don't mean an open-ended war, but there are many ways in which the Russians can keep the pot boiling in Ukraine at very little cost to them, but at very high cost to the Ukrainians. There's a kind of asymmetry there. Now, there is one thing that's clear to me. That is, whatever bravado you may hear from the Russian authorities, there is just no question. You can look at their reserves, the value of the ruble, the amount of revenue gotten from gas and oil. The sanctions and the decline in hydrocarbon prices have made a difference. And I think Mr. Putin is far too intelligent to believe that simple patriotic rhetoric will save the day if, in fact, the standard of living in Russia plummets. If that is true, it stands to reason that there is some economic incentive that can be thrown into the mix.
Way in the back here on the right side. Beyond you, way in the back, yeah.
Thank you. My name is Jeremy Weiss. I'm a professor at George Washington University Department of Political Science. I just want to see if I can pull together a couple of strands here that you've mentioned. You just said that if we were to meet here a year from now, this conflict might still be going on in some sense. You've said that the Donbass, especially if it's been heavily damaged by conflict, is not really a big prize, that Putin needs Kiev but probably can't get it. And you've said that there's no master plan, but do you think either that Russia is trying to engineer a type of frozen conflict that would keep Ukraine from ever solidifying relations with the West, or also that he's trying to drive a wedge between the European Union during a delicate time for Brussels when they're also dealing with the Euro crisis?
Your turn, I believe.
Yes. I think if they could freeze this conflict and achieve the terms that you're referring to, they probably would. But again, that's just me guessing. We really have very few insights into Russian thinking these days. It probably doesn't hurt from the standpoint of Russian policymakers to keep the European Union preoccupied with other problems that it has, and it does have quite a few of those problems. I think what you're describing is, in my view, a likely kind of set of goals that they're pursuing there.
The term frozen conflict, I would urge you to rethink, because everyone's saying this now. I'm not entirely sure what it means. It kind of sounds nice. I would say it's a simmering conflict modulated by Putin. In other words, think of him, I don't mean that he's in control of everything, but think of him as someone who has the capacity. It's like you're standing in front of a stove and you've got your hand on the gas nozzle or whatever one calls it, and the flame can go up and down. He's got the capacity to do that. So I don't think it's a frozen conflict so much as a conflict on some level of boil, which every once in a while looks like the water is going to come out of the pot. And that could continue on an open-ended basis, absent a political solution.
Okay, way in the back with you, yeah.
David Sadney, formerly with the State and Defense Department. A question for each of the speakers. For Gene, I understand your discussion about there's no master plan, but is there a grand ambition, something that perhaps Catherine the Great would recognize? And then for Mr. Menon, and first I should thank both of you for your book, and I'm sure I'll learn a lot from it when I read it. You talked about a potential key role for the U.S., but what is there that makes you think that would be positive? The U.S. role, there can be, I think, a reasonable argument made that 4 or 5 years ago the U.S. tried a policy of reset that may well have impelled Putin to see the United States as weak and conciliatory and helped him make a lot of the decisions he's been making. We just finished a 2-year exercise in trying to make peace in the Middle East, which resulted in a worse conflict in Gaza. So why do you think the U.S., just by having the U.S. starting to play a role, why do you think that'll be positive? Couldn't it just as likely be negative?
Gene, you want to go first?
Right. I think, what is the vision? Well, Dave, we've probably talked about it a number of times. It's very cool, but I think it's the same vision that endures that is really difficult to implement. I don't believe it's a vision of Russia as an empire. So in that sense, taken literally, Dmitry is right. But I think the vision that, the best I can reconstruct it, the vision is more like sort of, a constellation of major powers surrounded by smaller satellites. And it's these major powers that decide key questions in European and global security. Russia clearly wants to be part of that constellation. It's, again, my reading of the Russian literature and Russia as a whole is that for the Russian security establishment, after the Cold War ended, the idea that Bulgaria would have a vote and a veto in major European security decisions with NATO as the principal European security organization, and Russia would have a voice but not a veto, was really unacceptable. So in reality, I think Russia could have had a lot more than a voice and a veto, but that's just the understanding that the Russians have embraced in their view of European security. A lot of it really goes back probably to very 19th century-like thinking about what European security could be, it should be. I think that still endures. The notion of one country, one vote, and each country has an equal vote is something that Russians probably will not accept.
I think it was Primakov 25 years ago told us, it's going to be a multipolar world.
Right.
We didn't believe him then, but I think we're seeing this rise.
So you're, in essence, asking me quite appropriately the same question that Mr. Mary asked, also quite appropriately. So if I'm saying that the United States should play a role, I'm obliged to say why I think so and how that role ought to be. And I will grant you up front that the two of you may well be right. I'm not sure what the alternative is. But let me start with where you began, the reset. Sometimes, because it sounds so nice, we do foreign policy by label. So there's the reset, there's the pivot to Asia. In the end, I think both were rather vacuous. Soon after the reset, we sent an ambassador to Moscow who quickly, not blaming him for it, but for curious and complicated circumstances, in effect became inoperable. He was persona non grata in Russia. There could be no reset if the Russian leadership doesn't meet with the president's personal representative on site. In the case of the pivot to Asia, everyone in Asia is left wondering, what does that mean? And the Europeans are thinking, if you're pivoting to Asia at a moment like this, what does that mean? Do you not care about us? So, yes, we've done things poorly in the past, but I would say two things. If you're skeptical about, and rightly so, whether we should play a role, then we're obliged to think through what will happen if things continue as they are, and to use Mr. Mary's very picturesque language, that we continue sitting on our hands because the Europeans want us to do so. The fact that they want us to sit on the hands is neither here nor there, because if things go really bad, look, it'll affect them a lot more than it'll affect us. So we ought to learn from the past about what we did wrong. And we ought to be very clear about what we want to achieve. And we ought to be very clear about what we think Mr. Putin will want in return, and when we're prepared to give that to him. It may fail. It may fail. But I don't think, and this is where he and I disagree, the fact that somebody might resign from the State Department ought to worry Mr. Obama. He was awarded a Nobel Prize. This is a golden opportunity to earn it, actually, right?
Okay, do we have any more? We have one more here, and I think this will be the last question.
Yes, I'm Albert Ryabtsov, Embassy of Ukraine. First of all, I would like to thank Carnegie Endowment for the string of very interesting events, public events, devoted to our Ukrainian issues. Unfortunately, we are one of the priorities of the international policies now. It's unfortunate. Second, I would like to stress because I know the position of and the attitude of the participants of the event, on the lethal weapons for Ukraine issue. I would still stress the necessity of this kind of weapons. And not only in the purely military dimension of this issue, but as a political decision, as a signal for our Western partners. Believe me, it could be just the signal. We have Western partners which are almost waiting until the United States waves the flag, and we will have some necessary technique and armament. I wouldn't underestimate the Russian military. Russian military is very strong, effective, and powerful. They proved it in Crimea just a year ago, and we have this huge problem. So, secondly, I would like to stress the necessity of further sanctions against Russia, because the new Minsk agreement is already violated, under the Baltzevo and violated not by Ukrainian forces, but by separatists, with a clear Russian participation. And so this is, as for me, this is the evidence. And one question. Question is about the direct United States involvement into contacts with Russian Federation on the Ukrainian issue. Do you have the impression that the contacts are already happening? Because the day before yesterday, we were puzzled to hear that the full-fledged Russian delegation is participating in the summit of countering violent extremism in Washington. And this delegation is headed by the director of FSB, Mr. Bortnikov. The announcement came from State Department the day before the summit started. So could such kind of context be like a, not a pretext, but like a idea of also discussing Ukrainian issue and the kind of United States participation in our matters with Russians? Thank you.
Thanks, and I hope we'll have the answer to this and some closing remarks together. So, Gene, you want to go first?
Yes, Albert, you raise, very important issues, and they're very contentious, no question about it. And, believe me, when I sort of cast my vote one way or another, it's not an easy decision for me personally. What I think is happening in Ukraine really is a tragedy, and it's not a clear-cut case, but it's more of an on-balance type of a decision, and it's hard to make it, without really taking into account the gravity of the situation. On Mr. Bortnikov's visit, just like you, I was surprised to see his name on the list of, on the announcement. I have absolutely no information as to whether or not he has meetings beyond the one that he is formally attending. I can only say, in my view, it is an opportunity, and I hope somebody takes advantage of it. As to just the sort of closing remarks, I want to thank you all for coming to this event. We look forward to seeing you in the coming weeks and months. I am afraid, as Albert just said, this crisis will be with us for quite some time. And we here at Carnegie try to really do what we can to advance the conversation. So thank you. And thank you, Raj, and thank you, David, most of all, for moderating the conversation.
My pleasure. Raj, do you have anything else to add? Nope. Well, thanks to everybody for coming, and next time we'll have sunny, warm weather.
Writer and thinker on these issues, former National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia. Raj Menon, professor at City College in New York. In addition to the many writings and books that he's published, I think this is the first time he's co-written a book with Eugene. But for me, Raj will always have a very special place in my heart, in that his wife was my freshman Russian teacher and basically changed my entire life by getting me interested in this field. So I owe. No, I was terrible. And David Hoffman, of course, the longtime Washington Post former foreign editor and author of The Oligarchs and the Dead Hand. So with that, gentlemen, please begin.
Great. Well, thanks to everybody for coming. We're sorry about the snowstorm. We didn't arrange it. We had wondered whether we could have gotten Yuri Mikhailovich Lushkov to come and seed the clouds and change the weather, but we were unsuccessful at that. So thanks for coming again a few days later. This is a terrific book, and I'm really happy here to be talking with the authors, just so you can see the cover. It's very important. Please grab one if you haven't already. I was last invited to come talk about a book here 3.5 years ago. It was 2011, early September, and Dmitry Trenin of Carnegie had just published a book called Post-Imperium, and I led a discussion here with Dima about that book, and I was just the other day, pulled it off the shelf and looked again at some of the notes and some of our discussion, and it was a very optimistic time. Dmitry Medvedev was president and nearing the end of his term, and I noted in introducing the book that Trennan had concluded from his study that Russia had gone through a four-dimensional crisis since the 1980s and had let go of communism, had abandoned central planning, had walked away from the Cold War confrontation, and lastly, had given up the imperial state. And if you go back and look at that book, you'll see that Trennan makes the argument.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. And welcome to the Carnegie Endowment. I'm Andrew Weiss. I'm Vice President for Studies, and I'm really delighted that so many folks have turned up today. This is, if I'm properly counting, the second event we've had during our week of events dedicated to the first anniversary of the Ukrainian Revolution. We will have more stuff. Yesterday we had a live debate here hosted by NPR on the question of arming Ukraine, and the next week we'll have two more or three more events, depending on how you count. But I hope folks will also turn up. We're showing a movie by a prominent Ukrainian director, Sergei Loznitz, a documentary about what happened on Maidan, which will be on Wednesday evening, followed by a discussion with two correspondents who've just returned from Donbass, Philip Shishkin of the Wall Street Journal and Max Seddon of BuzzFeed. So keep an eye out for announcements of those events next week. Before we get started, if I could just ask folks to please turn your cell phones on mute, because this is event is being live broadcast, and I'd hate to have your novelty ringtone interrupt that broadcast. It is a great pleasure to have these three colleagues here and close friends. Their book is very important. I hope folks will take the opportunity to buy copies of the book in the back. I would only point out the first chapter will pretty much, if all you read is the first chapter, I think you will do yourselves a huge service. It's probably the most detailed explanation I've seen of how this conflict did not come out of nowhere, that this conflict has deep roots in the region, and that the tensions over Donbass go far back, far more than I realized, in terms of the history of both Ukraine, but also the history of the relationship that emerged in the post-Soviet collapse, 1991-1992 period. There's not much to say about Eugene Rumer that hasn't been said. He's the director of our Russia-Eurasia program here in Washington, D.C., very prolific.
That among all the other things happening to Russia at the time, that it did not attempt to restore the empire. And he wrote, there are not many active military conflicts over the borders, post-Soviet Russia. Most of the former republics, he said, are comfortable in their own skin. Well, it's 3.5 years later, and things have changed pretty radically. And I just wanted to mention this as a starting point for a discussion today that I hope will help cast some light on what has happened in those past few years to change things, and where are we going. And I think that this book is just chock-a-block full of important history about where we've come from. But we're not going to give you a history lesson today. I hope that we'll build on this and ask both of the authors to help us look forward. Because there's a lot of uncertainty, I think, especially in the West, about how to respond to this crisis. So we're going to divide up our presentation of the book into 4 relatively quick parts and then take questions. The 4 parts will be, first, Jean will address the question of how did we get here. Then Raj will take on the topic of Ukraine. What has happened? What lies ahead? Then we'll switch back to Jean again to ask the same questions about Russia. And lastly, Raj will take a look at the West and the United States. Where do we go from here? And after that, we'll open it up for questions and hopefully have a really terrific discussion, and we'll all leave certain about where we're going. So with that, let's open it up. Jean, how do we get here?
Well, David, first of all, thank you. Thank you to all of you for coming here today. Thank you to Raj for inviting me to participate in this project. It's been really a delightful joint venture, and I look forward to maybe another volume on post-Imperium or something along those lines. There is a short answer that probably will not be sufficient to the question of what happened. And Dmitry Trennan is a friend, a valued colleague here at Carnegie, and also a past co-author, because he and I once wrote a book together for which Raj wrote a foreword some years ago. It was about Central Asia. But what happened really is that later that month, is September of 2011, Mr. Putin decided to reclaim the presidency of Russia. And to anybody who says that personalities don't matter in politics, I will say think again. But there were also more long-term structural factors that I think we tend to overlook at times when it comes to thinking about trends that countries will follow and policies that their leaders will pursue. You know, I still believe that a lot of what Dmitry has said about Russia being in its post-imperial phase still is true, that we're not looking at Russia rebuilding the old empire, but I believe that Russia is moving towards some new form of perhaps being a hegemonic state in a space that it defines to be vital for its own interests. Perhaps we analysts oftentimes don't appreciate the extent to which historical, structural, and geographic factors really matter in shaping policies and politics of countries that we're observing. Jumping to how did we end up here, I can say that not just in 2011, but I had a chance to visit Kiev in September of 2013, 2 months before the outbreak of the Maidan Revolution. And there was not a single person I talked to in Kiev, and I talked to a lot of people, as many as you could cram on 2 or 3 days in that city. Nobody predicted what would happen in November of 2013 when then President Yanukovych suddenly changed direction and decided not to sign the association agreement with the European Union. There was nothing on the political landscape, nothing on the economic landscape, nothing on the security landscape of Russia and Ukraine to suggest at the time to us that the two countries would go to war. And what I think we were insufficiently appreciative of is the extent to which Mr. Putin himself took seriously the idea of Eurasian integration as a new form of Russian dominance in the post-Soviet space. So the events that led up to the crisis that began in November of 2013 are really something that I would compare to 4 large ships moving on their courses, which are destined to collide, but the collision point is somewhere over the horizon, and they don't have the radar to see that collision point. So they're proceeding not blindly, but not necessarily well informed. And these 4 ships were Russia, the United States, Ukraine, and the European Union. For Russia, it was the pursuit of this Eurasian integration idea that Mr. Putin clearly took very seriously, even if we didn't. For Ukraine, it was the path of trying to sit on 2 chairs at once. One, the European chair, and pursuing a deal with the EU that would result in financial benefit